Last time I spoke, I kind of started on this topic of Hebrew thought in the New Testament. We sort of went into a deep dive of a small number of verses. This time I'm going to take kind of a different approach. We're going to take a broad survey of a lot of them. And last time I think there were a couple things I covered. I showed you how there were, in some cases, when you can restore the original Hebrew thought behind what's being said, sometimes you get a more in-depth understanding of what's being said. Right? One of the examples I gave of that was showing you how stones are used as a symbol of what passes from father to son. And I went through some examples in the Tanakh, some more in the Gospels, and I showed you how that gave you a deeper understanding of what's going on. I also gave you an example where you got a different understanding of what's going on. And one of the examples I gave of that was when Yeshua said, just say yes, yes, no, no, and I explained how when you actually apply Hebrew grammar to that, it can actually come across as something very different than the way it comes across to us in English today. But most of the time, what it really does is it gives us a deeper understanding. We're going to see a lot of examples of that today. And also, one of the things I talked about last time was I sort of covered the fallacy that Israel had abandoned the Hebrew language and was speaking Aramaic in Yeshua's time. And I showed you guys several proofs of that, of why that wasn't true, including the second chapter of Acts, where people from, remember, Aramaic regions were amazed that men of Galilee could speak a language they could understand. So, obviously, they were speaking Hebrew. There was Hebrew thought going on, and it's going on not only in the Gospels, but all through the New Testament, and that's one of the things I'm going to cover in a little bit. I used this example last time. I just want to refresh your mind on it because this was one of the examples where you could see Hebrew and not Aramaic thought, where Yeshua, and he said, he who approaches you to go 1 mile, go with him 2, and he that asks of you, give, and with borrowing, do not turn away. And I had mentioned how the Hebrew word lavah, the same Hebrew word, lamed vav hey, when it's pronounced lavah, it means to borrow. When it's pronounced livah, it means to accompany. And this is kind of one where we've got two different thoughts going on that are rooted in the same word. But what we're going to see more examples, we're going to see there's some more examples of that. And let's see. I've got another one like that for you, kind of similar to it, where I think this one's important not only because it's similar to that one, but it's also important because there's a historical backdrop that goes with this. In Matthew 9:15, Yeshua said, "Can the sons of the groom mourn?" He's been asked why his disciples don't fast. And his reply is, "Can the sons of the groom mourn as long as the groom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom will be lifted up from them, and then they shall fast." Now, you guys can read this today, and because we've got hindsight, we know exactly what he was talking about. Right? He's talking about the resurrection. They didn't know what he was talking about. Okay? They didn't understand the concept of the resurrection that was to come, and they probably completely misunderstood what he was saying. And I want to explain to you why. The Hebrew word that you see here, spelled nun, shin, aleph, can mean lift. Another thing it can mean is marry. Because when two people get married, that's actually described as a lifting up in Hebrew thought. Okay? Now, when Yeshua said, "Can the sons of the groom mourn?" what kind of a picture is he describing here? He's kind of describing one where you've got a man who has children and no wife. So, in all likelihood here, the wife has probably died. Because usually for little kids, if they're divorced, they usually want to see the parents get back together. Seeing dad go marry another woman other than mom is not a happy occasion for most children. But seeing dad, but when mom's gone, if she's dead, then seeing dad bring a new mom into the picture might be a joyous occasion, right? He says, "Can the sons of the groom mourn as long as the groom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom shall be lifted up." Now, when is the bridegroom lifted up? Well, in Jewish thought, it would be exactly when this happens that you see in the picture. That's the picture that they probably had in their mind. Well, this is when he's lifted up, right? That's because that's how Hebrew-speaking people speak. So they had this picture in their mind, and they said, when the bridegroom is lifted up, then they shall fast. And that probably made no sense to them whatsoever. Because a marriage is not an occasion to fast, it's an occasion to feast. What do you do after people get married? Well, you feast for a week. That was the Jewish tradition. So they're sitting here saying, huh? And so this is kind of another area where when we restore the Hebrew thought, we kind of understand the historical backdrop to it a whole lot better. Now, one example I gave you last time, but I want to give you go into it a little deeper this time, was how in Matthew 13, I mentioned how there's a parable told of thorns and another one told of a mustard seed exactly after it. They're both the same parable. They're both getting across the same lesson. Both of those parables are about faith versus fear. And I had talked about how both thorns and mustard seed have the same first two letters in them as the word fear. And they're being used as an example of fear here. Okay, but in Matthew 13:22, there's another verse I want to tie into this. It says, this is where he's talking about the parable of the four different types of soil. There was the road, the rocky soil, the good soil, and then the soil with the thorns. Okay? And he says, the one who receives the seed fell among the thorns is he who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of riches choke it. So we're actually told what the thorns are here. This is his explanation of the parable, and we see that the thorns represent two things. One of them is worry or fear. So we're actually told, in no uncertain terms, that the harul, which is the thorn, symbolizes chared, which is fear. Okay? It's not, you've got wordplay going on, but one has been used as a symbol of the other. And he's actually talking about two different types of thorns here. One of them is the fear that the world is more powerful than God. The other thorn is the belief that the world is more powerful than God. There's a distinction between the two, but they're very closely tied together. Okay? Because when he talks about the worries of this life, he's actually talking about the guy who, he's got faith on this side of things. There's a piece to him that wants to believe in God and has faith, okay, because the spiritual man inside him understands that God is bigger than his power. Problems, right? Okay? But on this other side, you've got the natural man. And what does the natural man see? Well, the natural man knows things like, when you water grass that it grows. And the natural man knows that, when storms come, you should probably get inside. Okay, that's the way the natural man thinks. And he doesn't see God being more powerful than what's going on in this world. Right? And so it's real easy for that double-mindedness to set in. And it's easy for our fear of what's happening over here in the physical world to cloud our picture of that vision of God being bigger than what's in the physical world. Okay? So when he's talking about the worries of this life, he's talking about faith in God, but fear in the world. Okay? And James tells us that's a double-minded man. And James doesn't say that the double-minded man won't get his prayer answered, but he does say he shouldn't expect anything. And, sometimes even when we're double-minded, God will still answer your prayer. It's not like, the minute you have the slightest bit of doubt, forget it, not answering that guy's prayer. No, that isn't quite the way God works. But at that point, it's no longer in the realm of promise anymore. Okay? The other thorn, though, that he talks about, he calls the deceitfulness of riches. And what really is that? Well, the deceitfulness of riches is when you've got faith in worldly power and no fear of God. Almost the same thing, but kind of different. The poor man will very frequently pray that prayer, Lord, give us this day our daily bread. Because when you got no money, where else are you going to turn? Right? I mean, it can cure some people of atheism. Okay. And actually, I like the Hebrew version of this one a little better. Jerome, who translated the Vulgate for the Catholic Church, said that the book of Matthew was originally written in Hebrew, and that in the original Hebrew version of Matthew, the original version of that prayer was, Lord, give us today our bread for tomorrow. Whereas the Greek version says, give us this day our daily bread. And so if anyone asks you if there's any advantage to being...
That could be something totally different. He's trying to give you future blessings.
Yeah.
That you can claim those future blessings right now.
Yeah. That's one of the reasons why I guess I can jokingly say that is there any advantage to being a Messianic Jew? Well, yeah, you get your needs met a little bit sooner. If you want to stick with the Greek version, you go ahead and you wait on God to meet your needs just in time, and I'll get the extra interest payments off getting my money sooner. The rich man, if you're in the position of Donald Trump, you think Donald Trump goes to bed at night worrying about how he's going to pay his light bill?
I don't think Trump worries about his light bill too much.
I bet he doesn't.
No.
Okay.
Ready for the day and tomorrow.
But I want you to think about this. Nobody needs to pray that prayer, give me today my bread for tomorrow, more than the rich man. Because he's the person that's actually in danger of forgetting about the fact that God is his source. Okay? He's the one that needs to be reminded. When we just got done praising God, right? And, praise is not for God's benefit, it's for ours. Because we need to be reminded about how great God is. Okay? And that same basic principle applies to this issue I'm talking about right now. Okay? Because the poor man, like I said, is not going to forget about it because where else is he going to turn? But the rich man, it's real easy for him to rely on his natural means that he has at his disposal and forget about the fact that God is his source. And the truth of the matter is, God is still his source. There's a joke that some lawyers like to tell. It's not one that most of you would laugh at, but lawyers laugh at this. What's the difference between a rich man and a poor man? One liability suit. Your wealth could be gone tomorrow. You never know. You've got to keep in mind that God is still your source. Yes. You never know what's going to happen tomorrow, right? Something could come along and wipe out everything you have. Your protection is not what you have. Your protection is really in God. Just to prove to you that this was intentional, let me show you this example. Now, here, this is from Amos 8. God's talking to Amos, and he asks him, what do you see? And Amos says, a basket of ripe fruit. Now, ripe fruit in Hebrew is the word ketz. And then God responded to him by saying, the end has come. The word end is haketz. And this is an example of wordplay going on in Hebrew, where the symbol shares 2 out of 3 root letters with what it represents. We're told in no uncertain terms the ripe fruit represents the end. Okay? And there's a connection there both linguistically and conceptually. The ripe fruit, it's ripe, so it's at its end of needing to be on the tree, so it's ready to be picked, right? So there's a conceptual link, but there's also a linguistic link. And in the example I just got done showing you, we didn't have exactly all same 3 root letters. We only had 2 of the 3 in comparing Chanrul with Chanred. Okay, but we know that this one was intentional because God told us in Amos 8. And it appears again in the Gospels. So I think it's pretty safe to conclude that the examples of the mustard seed and the examples of the thorns were also intentional. And it's also one of the reasons why some people think that they read the parable of the mustard seed, and they think that the mustard seed is a symbol of faith, and it's talking about how much your faith can grow. Well, actually, I don't think that's what he's saying. I think it's very much the opposite. Because in reality, you don't need a lot of faith. You just need the absence of fear. You just need to not have this natural man over here, telling the spiritual man over here he's wrong. You just need to get rid of this side of the mental thinking. Doesn't matter how big your spiritual man is. Okay? Just as long as this guy gets smaller, gone, eventually. Somewhere in your walk, you hope he's gone because you don't listen to him anymore. And I think what he was really trying to say is that the mustard seed is a symbol of fear, and you plant it, it grows, and it swallows up your faith. It was actually a warning. What I've shown you here are examples from the Gospels. And a lot of people are going to say, okay, no big deal. Of course you're going to find examples in the Gospels. After all, Yeshua was talking to a Hebrew-speaking audience. And certainly he's going to speak to them in a language that they understand, right? He's going to be speaking to them in Hebrew because that was the language that they used. But this goes on in Paul's letters to Greek and Latin-speaking societies. I'm going to show you examples of that. Okay? Let's take a look at this next one. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, I had one more gospel example. Sorry, I should probably... Let me cover that one before I show you in Paul. This one's good. The reason I brought this one out is because it kind of demonstrates that you can't always restore the Hebrew thought if you write it out in Hebrew. And this is an example of why. He says, do not give holy things to dogs, and do not cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them with their feet, and dogs turn and pull them. Now, here, the word foot is regel in Hebrew. Resh, Gimel, Lamed. That's the Hebrew word for foot. The Hebrew word for common is regil. And in many ways, Jews do talk about things being uncommon or unholy as things they step on. When it says that I'll make your enemy a footstool for your feet, I'm going to put him under your feet. What's lower than your foot? Nothing. Okay? That's actually a bit of an insult of sort. And here's the Hebrew word for footstool, marglot. Almost exactly the same word, just one letter difference is the word for pearl, which is margliot in Hebrew. Now, what is a pearl? Well, a pearl is something that's very expensive and it's very valuable, right? I mean, you go to the store, they don't come cheap. You don't buy these with pocket change, right? Okay. But it's given a name that makes it sound like something very common. And if it was common, it wouldn't be expensive. So it's kind of been named something radically different than what it is. And because it's something that's very expensive but has been given a name that makes it sound like it's something cheap, it's used in Scripture as a symbol of something that people have a hard time judging as to whether it's valuable or not. Okay, it's being used that way here, where he says, do not throw your pearls before swine. Well, somebody's taking something valuable and treating it like it's something common. Right? So that's why the pearl was used as the symbol here. There's another place where he tells a parable about finding a treasure in a field. And he says that if you find a pearl of great price, a man will go off and sell everything he has to buy it. Now, of course, if he's doing that, if you're selling everything you have to buy it, it's because you're buying it for somebody that doesn't know what it's worth, right? I mean, that would be the reason you would do it. Somebody's selling you this pearl for $30 and you know it's worth $10 million. You're going to sell whatever you have to buy it at that price if you know it's worth way more than that. So that's another example of where you've got this very precious, expensive thing that's been given a name that's identically opposite to what it really is. And he uses it as a symbol multiple times for exactly that same concept. Now, I've written the words for pig and turn down here. You can see they're almost the same word. Chazar and chazir. Chazar means to turn in Hebrew. Chazir is how you say pig. But not only do you have wordplay going on between the concept of a pearl and feet, and wordplay going on between a pig and turning around, but there's also wordplay in Hebrew thought between a pearl and turning around. Because the Hebrew word panina is also another word for pearl. Now that's not a word that describes it like it's something common, but it is another word, a synonym for the word pearl. And another way of saying turn in Hebrew is pania. So this is an example where if you wanted to restore the Hebrew thought and write the sentence out in Hebrew, you couldn't actually restore all of the Hebrew thought. Because there's thought going on here. There's connections going on here that are actually, you start filling in these words with any set of Hebrew words, you're leaving out the other set that's here in the thought behind what he's trying to say. Going to Paul's letters. There is Hebrew thought in Paul's letters. Now, when Paul says, we will not all sleep, the concept of sleep is being used. He's talking about being dead, right? We understand that. He's not talking about what we do when we go to sleep every night, then wake up. But we call death sleep in the New Testament because we know one of these days the dead that are down there are going to wake up. There's going to be a resurrection one day. And those bodies are going to wake up and they won't be dead anymore. We could see that connection in any language, but in Hebrew, there's actually a linguistic connection between sleep and death. Because the way you say we die and the way you say naps in Hebrew would be spelled exactly the same way.
Huh.
Now, not only does that connection exist, let me show you this one. When he says, we will not all sleep, but will be changed, the Hebrew word spelled shin, nun, hey, can mean either sleep or change. If you pronounce it shana, that means to sleep. If you pronounce it shana, that means change. So what language was he thinking in when he wrote this?
Hebrew.
Obviously Hebrew. Okay. He wasn't thinking in Greek. He wasn't thinking in the language of the people he's writing to. He was thinking in his own language when he wrote this. If you wanted to try to write this in Hebrew, if you want to try to restore the Hebrew thought, you might destroy it trying to say it in Hebrew. It's difficult because it's confusing. Stop and think about it for a moment. If we try to replace the word sleep and change in here with the original words, you might confuse people with that. How would they read that? Actually, the grammar actually changes the form of the words because shana becomes nishan and shana actually becomes nishtana just due to the grammatical rules. So, you don't have the actual root letters. And so they look a little bit different, but just looking at that first phrase, we will not all blank. What's blank? Is that sleep or is it change? Well, depends on interpretation. If you leave it like this, well, what's he saying? We will not all change, but we will be changed? Is that what he's saying? I mean, how do you interpret that? Well, because this would be difficult to interpret if you actually write it in Hebrew, this may be part of the reason why God decided to convey Hebrew thought to us in a language other than Hebrew. Because it would have been confusing, and because it would have led to people preaching some really weird doctrines when they misread what it was actually trying to say. In fact, just to demonstrate that to you, I'm actually going to show you how this was translated into Hebrew by two different Hebrew translations. Okay, on the left here, this is the way it was worded in the Hebrew Bible Society translation into Hebrew, where they kind of got rid of the word sleep and said, we will not all die, but we will be changed. They just got rid of the word sleep. And that's how they eliminated the confusion. The Trinitarian Bible Society decided to do it a different way. The way they wrote it was, we will not sleep to death. They went ahead and translated it literally as sleep, nishan. Okay? But they added the word death into this so that you wouldn't misunderstand what he was saying. And you also would not misunderstand the nishan as being change instead of sleep. So they just interpretatively added the word death into it. And then they said, but we will be changed. And just to make sure nobody misunderstood that, they actually used a synonym for the word change. They didn't use nishtana, which is really at the root of the thought and the connection between these two parallel phrases here. They used the word nit chalaf, which is another way you could say it. But the great thing about that is it eliminates the confusion of thought that's there. Now, this is one where if you go back to the Aramaic Peshitta, it doesn't fix the problem. In fact, in the Aramaic Peshitta, they use a synonym for the word sleep and a synonym for the word changed, so that you've got complete clarity, but the original Hebrew thought is gone. Okay, here's another one. Romans 13:8. Paul says, "Owe no man anything except the continuing debt to love one another." Now, there's Hebrew thought in this, because the first word here in Hebrew, havu, means to give. The Hebrew word for love is ahava, and that's not an accident, it's not a coincidence. It's actually built from give as a root. The word for love is rooted in the word give in Hebrew, linguistically. What may be a little bit more of a coincidence, I don't know, is that the word debt, chayev, can also mean to be in favor of something or to be fond of something, to approve of something. So there's parallel concepts going on there. But, so when he says this, what language is he thinking in? Again, Hebrew. Because who would connect love with a debt in any other language? You generally wouldn't. They seem unrelated in most languages. 1 Corinthians 14:20. I love this one. Because this is one where nobody's going to be able to write this off as mere coincidence. It's too complicated. Paul says, "In regard to evil, be an infant, but in your mind, be perfect." Now, the word evil and infant can be spelled the same way in Hebrew. Because ayin, vav, lamed are three letters in Hebrew that when you pronounce it avel, that word means evil. It almost sounds like the way we say it in English, right? If you pronounce it ul, it means a little tiny baby. Now, is there a connection? Yeah, because babies are born in sin. And they don't know the difference between good and evil. And they need parents to explain it to them, right? He says, "In your mind, be perfect." Now, the word for perfect here, this is not just a coincidence because the word actually is derived from the Hebrew word for mind. But the Hebrew word for mind here, sekel, can be pronounced a number of different ways. If it's pronounced sekel, it means mind. If it's pronounced shekol, it means that which is everything. So that is another connection between the word mind and perfection. When it's pronounced sekel, it means to transpose.
Yeah, I just wanted to say some people's minds might feel like it's that which is everything. All that in a bag of grits.
Yeah.
Know-it-alls.
But if you take the word for mind in Hebrew and you pronounce it, if you take the Hebrew word for mind and pronounce it shakal, it means to lose a child. So, stop it. This is why this is too much of a coincidence to be a coincidence. Because the word for evil and infant can be spelled the same way. Okay? You could spell the words mind and perfected with the same Hebrew word letters. And you've got a connection between, well, first of all, you've got these words in the same place of the sentence, in the first sentence as you do in the second. And then you've got a connection between the second phrase and the first one. So that's too much of a coincidence to be a coincidence. Obviously, what language was he thinking in here? He was thinking in Hebrew when he wrote this. No doubt about it. He's actually talking about all the things, kind of like all these pronunciations in reality. Because he's talking about your mind. He's kind of talking about the sickle of the sickle, right? The transposing of the mind. He's talking about your mind growing up and losing a child. Losing its childness. I mean, that child you're supposed to lose is supposed to be you, right? Because you're not supposed to be immature in the things of God anymore. You're supposed to develop your mind into a perfected state. Sometimes this even works in reverse. Let me show you an example of that.
Age of accountability. All that stuff.
Once again, here's another case. This is another verse where the Peshitta, the Aramaic Peshitta, doesn't fix the problem. Here's what you actually see in the Peshitta. It does not succeed in restoring the original Hebrew thought that's behind this. So, here's another one that's fun. Romans 11. In Romans 11, Paul says, he's talking about Israel and the Gentiles. And in talking about Israel, he says, through their fall, salvation has come to the Gentiles to provoke them to jealousy. And then he goes on to give an analogy in which he describes Jews as the natural branches and Gentiles as the grafted in branches. Right? Okay. The word branch in Hebrew, there's a couple of different words for it. But you could call a branch samach or netzar, but the word netzar in Hebrew is actually built from the word tsar. Right? This word is actually built from this one. Tsar means something that's thin or narrow. So when you talk about a branch as a netzar, you're talking about a thin object. It's describing a branch as something that's very thin. Okay? Or at least thin in relative respect to what it came out of, because a tree branch is a lot thinner than the tree it came out of, right? Okay. That's simple linguistics. But in Hebrew thought, there is a phrase called sarot ayin, which means narrowness of the eye. That's the literal translation of the word. But the figurative translation of that phrase is jealousy. And in Hebrew thought, jealousy is described as having a very narrow view of things. Okay, sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad. Right? I mean, when two people get married, they're supposed to have a very narrow view of who they get romantic with, right? So that is an example of jealousy that is not a bad thing, because that's an area where you're supposed to have a narrow view of things. But there's other areas where you're not supposed to have a narrow view of things. One of them might be that if mom and dad give a blessing to one child, should the other child get jealous? Okay, they shouldn't, right? I mean, they should really be happy for their sibling. And they should understand that one day their day is going to come too, where mom and dad are going to bless them. Maybe not at the same time. Maybe at a different time. Sometimes this works in reverse. Paul said concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given the order to the churches of Galatia. Now, if you write Galatia out in Hebrew, you'd actually have a word that could be translated as the dispersion of the Lord. And of course, dispersion would be what? The opposite of collection. Was this an accident? Nope, I don't think so. God, why was the church in Galatia picked? I mean, Paul's probably given instructions to a whole bunch of different cities. So why was this one picked? Well, because there was a connection. One of the things that I hope you can see after this number of examples is that there's a trend. New Testament symbols are almost always connected to the concept through Hebrew thought. Not English, not Greek, not Aramaic. This is not something where an Aramaic New Testament fixes the problem. It's in Hebrew that you want to find this. And I've shown you examples of this here, such as the thorns and the mustard seed with fear, okay, sleep and change, branch of jealousy. Last week or last time, we talked about stone and what passes from father to son. Okay, ripe fruit and the end. These are not the exceptions. These are the rule. I would actually say that it would probably be very difficult. I'd actually like to see someone find an example where I couldn't explain it in Hebrew thought.
So we see the gospel writers and the Apostle Paul, we see their Hebrew mindset showing through, even when Paul's writing to people in Greece or Thessalonica or whatever, behind he could speak Greek, the Greek words that he's writing to those people there, so they'll understand. But we see the Hebrew mindset coming out in Paul. How about others like like James or Peter or James or John? Have you looked at
Oh,
the
yeah.
writings?
Yeah, I
You
haven't
see
showed
the
you-
same thing there.
I haven't showed you all the examples I know about. I picked Paul here because he'd be the one you'd least expect it out of. I mean, he was the apostle to the Gentiles, okay? And he wrote to cities that weren't speaking in Hebrew. Actually did give you all, I think, a few examples of Revelation a few months ago where there was Hebrew thought in the rewards and punishments. When it was every place where it talks about he who overcomes in each of the letters. Okay, so that's kind of another one in the writings of John.
So you see it in Luke and all of them.
It's in all of them. Yeah, it's in all of them.
That's really interesting.
And like I said, I'd really love to see someone pick one. I couldn't find it in. But anytime you see symbols loaded up in Hebrew, that's probably where the answer is. Now, it's not just in symbols, because there are examples I have talked about that don't involve symbolism. Lava and leva was one of them, okay, because that accompanying and borrowing was a link between two different things he said, but there wasn't any symbolism in that. It was just two different things. Lift and Mary was another one, what I talked about last time, when he says, say yes, yes, no, no. Again, that was another example of it. So it doesn't always necessarily involve symbols. We see Hebrew thought in the New Testament where symbolism isn't involved, but almost any time you see symbolism involved.
Okay. Yeah,
Well,
that's interesting.
any other questions? Well, I guess I'm done.
Good. Yeah.
Click below to subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to visit my website at www.messiahalive.net. That's www.messiahalive.net.